greater than it ordinarily be this time of year in this country. But thank you so much. You know, of course, that the Human Rights Centre annual lecture is a highlight and a showcase of the work that we are doing and the partnerships and the relationships that we have with the wider human rights world. In previous years, we've had a whole array of various superstars, human rights superstars, including UN Special Rapporteurs and the current UN Secretary General. This year, no pressure, Martha. This year, we have Martha Spurrier, who is the Director of Liberty UK. Martha may want to speak a little bit more about Liberty and the directions that it's been taking over the last couple of years or so. Martha had very large shoes to fill in those of Shamli Chakrabarti, who was her predecessor. And Liberty obviously is engaging with a very broad range of human rights challenges in this country and beyond. The state of this government, I spent half my year in France. Coming here increasingly is like coming to some hostile environment. It's really just peculiar. I mean, France is a deeply compromised country, right? But coming here, given all of the human rights challenges that this government apparently doesn't seem to care very much about any longer, is a bit depressing. But wonderful. It's work such as Liberty and the work, of course, that we are doing here to address those various challenges. Martha's going to speak for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. We will then have an opportunity for a Q&A, and I may make some kind of semi-informal comments about the content of Martha's lecture. We then have a barbecue with one complimentary drink. We are operating on a restricted budget, I have to say. We also couldn't make a big song and dance about the barbecue and the party because we had a restricted budget, ultimately. So what we now are able to do, given the responses that we've had to the invites that we have sent out, is to invite all of you, as we would have done initially, of course, had we had enough money, because resources is always a challenge in a university. But all of you, please come and join us after this event at Wivenhoe House. I think we're out in the garden. It's a lovely evening, I'm sure, from 6:30. One complimentary drink, and a barbecue meal, and an opportunity just to relax, really, and chat and talk about human rights or not, just case may be. Martha, you're better placed to introduce yourself. You know yourself better than Freud, notwithstanding. You know yourself better than I do. I'm going to pass the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks very much for having me. I feel like the university thing to do is to sort of stride up and down. That's not very barristerial, which is my background. I would like to be rooted to this lectern, but I'm going to try and be more, you know, Apple TED Talkish. No microphone, like if you can't hear me, just give me a wave, but I'll try and talk loudly and clearly. I wasn't going to say much by way of introduction. I'm a lawyer and a human rights campaigner. I run Liberty, which is a big NGO in the UK doing human rights work, and before that I was a practicing lawyer doing human rights work. And before that I was a student of history, and within that I was a student of the history of ideas, the history of political ideas. And I think one of the things I wanted to talk about today is ideas, or the dearth of them, in the current space that the political space that we're all living in, but also the human rights space. Not that there's a dearth academically of ideas, but there's a dearth of trying to get those into practice. There's a dearth of long-term thinking from where I'm standing. And that's, I think, one of the things that's perhaps holding us back. And part of the reason I specialised in the history of political ideas was genuinely a little bit because I have no head for dates or monarchs or battles, but also because I have a deep interest, and it's the same interest that eventually led me to want to work in human rights, in what ideas are and where they come from and why some take hold and why some don't, and what it is about some of them, even though they're so ephemeral and so hard to pin down, that they nevertheless have a hugely powerful impact on our community. And I became kind of fascinated by the idea of what makes a community and how much you can do the work of community building, not on capital or soil or labor or whatever, but on ideas and on something that is more imaginative, more visionary. And for anyone who's ever come anywhere close to doing a history degree or being interested in history, you'll have heard of Benedict Anderson, who wrote this great book called Imagined Communities in the 1980s and 1983. And in that book, he talked about the nation. So just put aside, we'll come to nations as whether that's a good way of defining anything, but he wrote this nice thing that I've come back to many times. I propose the following definition of the nation. It's an imagined political community. It's imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, never meet them or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity or genuineness, but by the style in which they are imagined. The nation is imagined as a community because, regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people not so much to kill as willing to die for such limited imaginings. And that idea of an imagined political community is one that has continued to preoccupy me. And when I first read that, and I can remember it when I was like 19 and a student, the thing that I was really drawn to was this idea of deep horizontal comradeship and what that meant and the ideas that you needed to define that and to breathe life into it. And thinking about, like I say, Anderson's talking here about a nation, but what happens if you take away the borders? What comradeship are you talking about then? Or what happens if you take away humanity as the golden thread and you expand it across species, or you stretch it across time and you think about future generations or whatever? And one of the reasons that I went from history to human rights was because I was drawn to the human rights framework, because in it I felt that I'd found a system, a limited system like scaffolding poles rather than a whole built environment, around which perhaps you could start to build some of that deep horizontal comradeship. And I want to come back to the scaffolding because, like, as you'd expect, I want to talk a little bit about why that's also important and why it's under threat right now. But I wanted to reflect on one of the other things in that passage that now feels really important. So, like I say, it started with this imagined community and the deep horizontal comradeship. But then latterly, something else about it has caught my eye, and that's that last line that I hadn't paid much attention to before, that so many millions of people, not so much to kill as willing to die for such limited imaginings. And that phrase, limited imaginings, the more I've done my job, the more I've been a lawyer or a campaigner, the more I've run Liberty, the more I've come to believe that it is limited imaginings that are holding us back. I have found myself countless times bemoaning a lack of political imagination, a lazy formulaic reliance on a handful of tropes, a handful of responses to social issues, a handful of assumptions about what people think, and a handful of political orthodoxies about what can and can't be done, what can and can't be demanded. Really limited imaginings. And of course, there's a reason, because limited imaginings are really very helpful for people in power. It's a very useful way to conserve power and privilege and the stability of those things. And what they definitely don't want is people getting ideas above their station. But it kind of makes me come back to where I started, which is like, but there are sometimes these big ideas that do catch on, that are wild and disruptive and destabilizing and fanciful, and yet nevertheless 50 years down the line, 100 years down the line, feel so normal that we can't even see them. They're just the water that we're swimming in. And I think the danger is if we're too focused on the here and now, and as I say, don't get me wrong, like there's a lot of important stuff to be focused on right now. We talked today on the 5-year anniversary of the Grenfell tragedy as a flight takes off to take asylum seekers to Rwanda. There's a lot going on, but that the danger is if we're too focused on that, then we might forget to have those fanciful and destabilizing ideas. And those ones, if they catch on, those ones are the ones that have the capacity to be really transformative for the political community that we're all a part of. And, then I kind of ended up thinking about literature. And obviously there's a very rich theme of dystopian modern literature, Orwell and Atwood and Huxley and Kurt Vonnegut, who have done a very good and useful job at pointing out some of the dystopian futures that may come to pass or that have already come to pass. Whether that's surveillance or environmental disaster or enslavement or whatever. But I think in the 16th century, there was also a very rich theme of utopian literature. There's less of that now. Some people, Ursula Le Guin has made like really amazing contributions to it, but it's not, we don't call it up in the way that we do culturally dystopian literature like that of Orwell. And right now, I think many people, and certainly many human rights activists, and I would probably put myself among them, do feel as though we are living in a bit of a dystopian place. And one of the psychic effects of feeling like you live in a dystopian space is, I find, a kind of imaginative planning blight, which means that when you're in the proverbial trenches fighting for the shreds of what you've got, it's very hard to find the headspace and the imaginative freedom to spend real concentrated time imagining what the utopia might look like and what we need to do to slowly build the way to get there, not for me and my generation or maybe even the next generation, but the one after that, like creating things that will last way beyond us. And so my kind of feeling at the moment is that we need probably a revival of utopian literature as a genre, but that's not something within the sphere of my control. And so instead, I think we all need to be better utopianists in the way that we think and develop the muscle, like develop a utopian thinking practice. Ursula Le Guin, who I just mentioned, said in her, she wrote this brilliant utopian novel called Dispossessed. And she wrote, "We live in capitalism and its power seems inescapable, but then so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, the art of words." So I feel like, you know, this is a lecture, so we can kind of pray at the altar of words and think if we articulate some stuff today, like I'll do it a bit and then it'd be lovely to hear from all of you, then that might be the start of just of crystallizing some of these more utopian ideas. But before we get there, like I say, I'm just going to do a bit of here and now because it's too important and stressful not to. So I don't know what everyone's background is in this room, and this may be a little bit of preaching to the converted or telling you to suck eggs or whatever. But starting with the basics of like, why even human rights? Why even that as a framework, as a thing, as an idea? So obviously, at their core, the point of human rights is to protect people from an overweening state, upholding the rule of law, upholding democratic values, written down by great legal minds after the horrors of World War II, hopefully, supposedly, to prevent genocide from ever happening again. Over the years, scrutinized by judges, finessed by great brains, academics, all the rest of it, and endorsed by nations across the world. They are very political in the sense that they belong in a political system, but of course they're not tainted by party politics. Supposedly, we can come on to talk a little bit more about that. Not beholden to religion, but not a secular instrument either. Flexible, so again, meant to be to the operational demands of something like military combat or policing, designed to operate a constant balancing act between individual and community interests, qualifying both things all the time in a dynamic way. There's loads of reasons you could pick up like any common or garden human rights textbook to give you the reasons why you might think, oh, it seems like a good philosophy, a good idea that I can sign up to. But and that's kind of how I got to human rights, was in a fairly academic, legalistic kind of way. But I think it's worth just stopping for a minute to remember what actually the more profound and potent reason is for this whole superstructure of a theory. One which shows that all those thinkers and academics and judges are right, but they're right not necessarily just because this stuff is intellectually sound, but because it comes from something quite instinctive that a lot of people, perhaps most if not all people, share. And I really learned that when I was a lawyer. I found myself, I specialised in lots of different actions against the state, so particularly suing the police and doing cases representing families who had lost loved ones in care, in custody, in various different iterations of state control. And the point of those inquests, right, is that it's a kind of full and fearless investigation into what's gone wrong. And the idea is justice for the family and for the person who's died, but in a way, more importantly, the idea is looking forward and forcing the state to learn lessons so that that doesn't happen again. And every single bereaved family you ever represent, when you sit down at your first meeting with them and say, like, you know, this process can't bring them back, and so it will never truly be justice, but if you could have one thing from it, what would it be? To a person, they say, I never want any mother, sister, family to go through what I have been through. I never want anyone to go through what I've been through. And I had, again, so many experiences like this that I could kind of write a book about them. Would be very repetitive. But very early on, in one of the first kind of big inquests that I did, it was a death in psychiatric care of a woman called Gemma who'd taken her own life. And it was incredibly, obviously all these cases are incredibly sad, and it's very trite to even say it, but I think it bears saying. And in this case, there had been this litany of deeply tragic and also deeply mundane failings that ultimately had caused her death, and that in the end was what the jury decided. And one of the failings was that Gemma, who'd been in and out of psychiatric care for much of her teenage and adult life, had for various reasons ended up in an unfamiliar hospital at this particular time when she was having a crisis. Records hadn't been properly migrated across. No one had been able to contact her parents, who were a real lifeline for her. And we had this CCTV footage where Gemma was brought onto the ward and she sat on a chair in a corridor, and it's not got sound, but you kind of get the impression she's been told by a nurse, like, wait there a minute and someone will come back for you. And the CCTV runs and runs, and she's there for 3 hours. And she sits there with her hood up, hunched over, and no one talks to her, no one stops and says hello. People, it's a busy ward, people just passing her by. And then eventually someone comes and takes her to a room, and she's then put in this room and she's left again, and that's the room where she then found the means to take her life. And as I say, like the evidence in that inquest revealed things that were really shocking and sad and fundamentally really avoidable, and yet you do many of these cases and avoidable things happen all the time. Records have been falsified, notes had disappeared, incorrect dosages of medication, all kinds of terrible, mundane but terrible things. I think this, in a funny way, the saddest detail was that when, and it's a detail that signifies how kind of the state and bureaucracy and big institutions can kind of take life in a way that is very cheap, basically. When the paramedics, when the people who worked on the ward found Gemma, they dialed 999, and the paramedics arrived and they rushed into the room to try and revive her. And they turned to the nursing staff that were in the room, there were 4 of them, and they said, "What's this young woman's name?" And none of the nursing staff even knew. And I remember watching the jury when that piece of evidence came out, feeling from behind me how it hit the family, feeling myself like this is one of those details. You're not going to see it reported in the Guardian, it's not going to be the headlines, but it's a detail that tells you how badly wrong care can go, how dangerous it is when you don't have the systems that you need to protect. The reason that I'm going on about all of this is to go back to the point I was making about there being something very instinctive about human rights. So, 99% of the time you're not representing lawyers in these cases, right? These are people who have never had any cause to think about human rights. You only have to think about there's something's gone wrong. They really are the last refuge of the damned. And so quite often I would end up having these conversations with people where they'd be like, well, to be honest, like I used to read all about Article 8 and immigration, and I've been quite anti-human rights until now, and it's only now that I realize X or Y, the usual stuff that you would imagine that any of us would feel about things we don't know anything about, have no experience about. And in this case, Gemma's parents, so her mum was a retired social worker, her dad was a train driver, and her brother was training to be a police officer. And we sat over a cup of tea in one of the breaks of the inquest, and they were recounting to me how they had got to where they were, to having a lawyer and having the inquest. And they said soon after Gemma had died, they were in the kitchen and the phone rang, and the mum answered the phone, and the hospital said, "I want to assure you that we have done a full investigation into what happened with Gemma, and there's going to be a really detailed report, and one of our doctors has overseen it, and we've left no stone unturned, and lessons will be learned." And Gemma's mum described putting the phone down and turning to her husband and son and saying, like, it just doesn't seem right to me that the hospital is investigating what happened. Like, this just doesn't feel right to me. And then she said they talked more and more about how, even though they did get this quite kind of weighty report, more and more about how it just didn't feel right that the hospital were marking their own homework, and more how they felt that it was plain for anyone to see that Gemma posed a risk to herself when she was in crisis, and that it shouldn't have been that hard, that surely the point of a doctor, the point of a psychiatric care system is to protect people in that moment. And isn't there something that means that you can say you should have done this and you didn't do it? And then, of course, like wind forward however many months it took to get to an inquest, and I'm there solely because legal aid is provided for lawyers in that moment to try and hold the state to account, solely because of Article 2, which says that absolutely Gemma's mum was right, the hospital can't mark its own homework and there has to be an independent investigation. And that absolutely Gemma's mum was right, someone who is vulnerable, someone who has mental health issues, for example, does have duties owed to them by the state. And doctors, nurses, care providers do have to do things to protect their life. And it was funny because we sat there with them describing the letter of the law, like, almost in layperson's terms, it was like Article 2 and all the different duties that fall under it. And they never read it, because why would they have needed to, or why would they have bothered? And probably if they did read it in its legalistic version, it wouldn't have meant anything to them. But they were articulating exactly what the framework is all about. And that moment, and like I say, it happened so many times when I was practicing, for me is why, and we'll come on to the kind of critiques, very valid, very fair, of the human rights framework, but it's why I think it's still an ideas system that's worth fighting for, because it comes from something very deep in people, a very deep sense of what is fair and what is just. And the systems often let us down when we then try and make those things real, but I think it's very human. And the sad thing is that I would challenge anyone to have a conversation with someone like Gemma's mum and come away and think, do you know what, I still think the right thing to do is to repeal the Human Rights Act or pull us out of the European Convention on Human Rights. Like, it, I know we're meant to be able to kind of imagine ourselves into someone else's shoes and someone else's ideology, but that, whether it's the Hillsborough families, people who are the families, people who died in Grenfell or survived the fire, I really struggle to see how any decision maker can look any of those people in the eye and say, we're going to get rid of this, we're going to get rid of this tool that you have to hold us accountable for what we failed to do. But of course, diminishing them is exactly what this government has in its sights. Not the first government to do so, like, important not to see this as party political. The Labour government invented the Human Rights Act, put it on the statute books, and the minute that it was there, 9/11 happened, and they wanted to get rid of it straight away because it constrained how they would do counter-terror policing. The coalition government did the same for other reasons, and Theresa May and David Cameron, and now Boris Johnson. So I do think it's important to recognise this is not a Tory project, it's a power project. People in power don't like the fact that human rights constrains what they can do. And so successive governments will try to erode human rights. But this government is going further and is getting closer to actually doing it than any of the previous governments who have threatened to do so. And I think the difference from where I'm standing, and like in a way my life is quite boring at the moment because I've actually campaigned to save the Human Rights Act 3 times now, and it's not the most sort of intellectually interesting exercise, just regurgitating the same things again and again when you do media. But the difference this time is that before we would be fighting about the Human Rights Act, or we might also be fighting about some counter-terror legislation or some public order legislation or whatever. And now, like, the Human Rights Act is a key concern, but it's one of like a lot. And it forms an agenda of an attack on executive accountability that is so thought through and so strategic that for all the bumbling, for all the idea of chaos and not getting anything done that this government kind of put out, behind the scenes, through a succession of really oppressive pieces of legislation, they have been taking away people's rights, people's ability to hold them to account in all kinds of different ways. So just to give you like a quick run through of some of the lowlights, and like this is the dystopian part of the lecture. So we had the Elections Act. I don't know how many people voted in the recent election, the local elections, but that is the last time you'll ever be able to walk into a polling station without voter ID, photographic ID. Estimates are that it will disenfranchise 2 million people, and that those 2 million people are the people who already find it the hardest to get to the ballot box. So particularly people from trans communities, for example, Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities. The Judicial Review Act got passed earlier this year. That ties the hands of judges in what remedies they can grant when they find that a public body has done something irrational or unlawful or contrary to human rights. The Nationality and Borders Act, and of course, I could say we're here today in the context of the first Rwanda flight. The Nationality and Borders Act is a kind of entrenchment of the idea of Fortress Britain, and it makes what was already a pretty racist and inhumane immigration system even worse. The Policing Act, around which there was a huge and pretty wonderful and successful campaign, but we'll come on to the sting in the tail of that one, took away basic rights for the Gypsy Roma traveller community, and it also outlawed a whole range of protest activities which hitherto had always been legal, including the idea of a noisy protest is now unlawful. The sting in the tail of that story is that until about 2 months ago, this was my like morale boosting thing. I was like, you can have a government with an 80-seat majority, you can have a public who don't have any sympathy for Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil, but the House of Lords, you know, whatever you think about an unelected chamber, the House of Lords have stepped in and they have said that these protest measures are completely awful, contrary to the rule of law, contrary to democratic principle. And that was true, and that was a great win, and it was very valuable in galvanizing everybody and making us all feel pleased that we had finally made a bit of progress. And then in the Queen's speech, or the Prince's speech, whatever we're meant to call it, they introduced a public order bill, which regurgitates all of the measures that were thrown out by the House of Lords earlier this year. So it makes things like locking on to so like when, you know, protest and you go and lock on to something, classic like tactic used by the suffragettes, locking on to another person, a thing, locking a thing to a thing, will become a crime. Going equipped to lock on, so wandering around with some super glue or a bike lock, a crime. Digging a tunnel, a crime. Going equipped to dig a tunnel, a crime. Interfering with national infrastructure, a crime. Introduction of a thing called serious disruption prevention orders, otherwise known as protest banning orders, where if you've attended a protest in the two protests in the last 5 years, even if you've done nothing criminal at all, you could have a civil order imposed on you, preventing you indefinitely from attending any other protests, with potentially invasive conditions, including electronic monitoring, and if you breach any of those conditions, up to a year in prison. Stop and search powers expanded in a way that we just never thought that we'd see. So again, like, you know, you'll know about stop and search. It's one of the most controversial and corrosive policing tactics that there is. They used to have stop and search for terrorism, but the courts ruled it unlawful, suspicionless stop and search. And Theresa May got rid of it on the grounds that it wasn't justified. And like, I don't think we should have any suspicionless stop and search, but if you're going to have some, you might say for terrorism where people might actually be killed because of an actual serious crime. The proposal in this bill, which we think will probably go through, is to introduce suspicionless stop and search for protest activity based on no criminal conduct at all. So the police need no grounds of suspicion whatsoever to stop someone and search them. And of course, we know stop and search, suspicion-led stop and search, you're 7 times more likely to be stopped if you're Black or from a community of colour. Suspicion-less stop and search, you're 14 times more likely. It's twice as racist as a policing power. We also have a new national security bill coming down the track, which does a whole range of things, including giving counter-terror police more powers and removing legal aid for people who've been convicted of terror offences. So, for example, you wouldn't be able to get legal aid to challenge a parole decision if you were in prison for terrorism offences, and does a whole range of things in relation to stopping people challenging the state if they've ever been convicted of a terrorism offence. And then there are also rumours of plans to erode data protection rights in a new data protection bill and to overhaul the Freedom of Information Act. So it's like when you stack it all up, and obviously we haven't even got onto the big ticket item of the British Bill of Rights, when you stack it all up, it really is, it's a carefully planned agenda at the ballot box, in the press, in the courts, trying to shut down accountability. So, as I say, the big ticket item is repealing the Human Rights Act and replacing it with the British Bill of Rights. And, you know, in many ways, the clue's in the name. We haven't seen a bill yet, but there was a very detailed consultation. And everything that we've been told is that a bill will come in the next few months and that it will very much mirror what was proposed by the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, at the end of last year. There are a lot of things we're worried about in the bill, and this is one of those things I could kind of talk about all day and I won't. But 5 of the headline concerns. So one, and this you can see trailed in the rhetoric around the Rwanda policy, one is to gut Article 8. So Article 8 is the right to family life and private life. One of the proposals is to gut it, particularly in relation to immigration. Although obviously if you tamper with it, it's very hard to see how you don't also affect things like your right to medical treatment, your right to private data, your right to adopt a kid, all of those things. But the proposal is no longer have it as unlawful to deport someone to a country where they would face human rights abuses. They don't go so far as to say you could deport someone to a place where they would be tortured, but they do say you could deport someone to a place where they would face arbitrary detention or an unfair trial, which again, like, I don't know how many human rights nerds there are in the room, but that's like fundamental. You know, the whole point of this like superstructure that was set up is that states do not collaborate with other states or ever endorse what are called the fruits of the poisonous tree. So evidence obtained through torture, for example, that would render a trial unfair. We'll see, you know, today you may have seen that Boris Johnson announced that if the Rwanda policy is eventually ruled unlawful, so the substantive judicial review will happen next month in the High Court, if it's eventually ruled unlawful, they will consider pulling out of the European Convention on Human Rights. There is a thesis, I don't know whether it's true, but there is a thesis that all of this stuff that they're doing with the British Bill of Rights is to set them on a collision course quite deliberately with Strasbourg, so that eventually they have a kind of narrative with which they can pull out of the Council of Europe, following Russia, just to give you an idea of the bedfellows.
Yeah, but we don't like that.
Yeah, we don't. We're better than that.
Okay.
Yeah. Second area of concern is around positive obligations. So these are the obligations I was talking about with Gemma's case, the obligations on state bodies to take proactive steps to protect rights, the thing that the Hillsborough families used to get their fresh inquest, for example, the things that the survivors of sexual assault and rape by John Warboys used to hold the police accountable for their failures to investigate. Scrap them on the grounds that they create too much of an onerous burden on public bodies. Again, you might think, what's the point of a public body if, but that's the rationale. Third one is proportionality. So again, like slightly nerdy legal point, but the way that qualified rights, so things like free expression and protest and family life, are thought about in the courts is a balancing exercise, like what's proportionate? What's a proportionate interference? And the government are proposing to effectively load the dice and put more factors on the side of the state than on the side of an individual. So things like national security concerns, to make it very difficult indeed, in what I will say is already quite a difficult environment to ever win one of these cases in front of quite a hostile and conservative court, to make it even more difficult to win cases in those situations. Number 4 is limiting what courts can do when they're faced with a human rights violation. So one of them, which again sort of it illustrates that one of the points of this agenda is to undermine the idea of universality. One of the things is that if you win your human rights case, at the point at which a judge decides what remedy to grant you for winning, for the violation that you've suffered, they can take into account past conduct, not just past conduct in relation to the case, but past conduct through your whole life. Now, obviously, that's bad, but it's particularly bad because people who the state deems to behave badly, protesters, people in prison, people in police custody, are the people who are at the receiving end of human rights violations more often than other people. And so, you know, like my bread and butter as a lawyer was suing the police for people who very often had committed a crime. But that wasn't an issue, but they didn't need to be beaten up or they didn't need to be denied healthcare in prison. If I had brought those cases now, under these proposals, I might win my case. There might have been some egregious human rights violation against someone in police custody, but because that person earlier on had committed a GBH or whatever, they might then be denied any remedy at all, which of course is bad for the individual, but again, as a signal to public authorities to say that there's basically impunity for committing these kinds of violations, it feels pretty strong. What I think is then potentially the most worrying proposal of all is a proposal to stop judges from having the power, again, this sounds legalistic, so just bear with me, to stop judges from having the power to strike down secondary legislation that's found to be in violation with human rights. So again, like I don't know where to pitch this in terms of sucking eggs and whatever, but you have primary legislation, the big bills of parliament, like the ones we've just talked about, go through both houses of parliament and get a measure of scrutiny. I mean, like when you have a big majority, that measure of scrutiny is watered down, but it's a measure of scrutiny, a kind of line by line analysis, different stages, etc. And then finally get royal assent. But sitting underneath primary legislation, you have secondary legislation, which very often gets no scrutiny at all, or only very limited scrutiny. It doesn't get the same treatment as primary legislation. For that reason, secondary legislation can be challenged on the grounds that it's incompatible with primary legislation. It's actually just a sort of iteration of parliamentary sovereignty, Because if you have secondary legislation contrary to primary legislation, the courts will say, well, that means that the executive, the government, have issued their secondary legislation. It's kind of like ministerial fiat, but they've done so contrary to the will of Parliament as expressed in primary legislation. So in the human rights context, you might say, like, these emergency COVID regulations, for example, don't have an exemption for protest. Therefore, we say that they are contrary to human rights. Human rights is primary legislation, so they can be struck down because they're unlawful, they're contrary to the will of Parliament. The government is now proposing to take that power away from judges so that you could have a situation where secondary legislation stands, even though it's contrary to human rights law, even though it's contrary to the will of Parliament. And the reason why I say it's one of the most concerning ones is because, one, this government has really pioneered legislating through secondary legislation. So they have an enormous amount now in secondary legislation, a kind of pace and scale of secondary legislation that's very hard to keep up with very significant things buried in the detail that would previously have been contained in primary legislation. And so already the power is immense of that secondary legislation, and the danger of it going out with the bounds of what Parliament wants it to do is very real. But also, it completely turns the rule of law on its head, and it elevates executive power above parliamentary sovereignty in a way, of course, which is completely contrary to what the government would have you believe they're doing with this whole agenda. Number 5, and I'm going to be done with this list of miseries, is a whole range of procedural barriers. So things like having to seek permission to even bring a human rights claim, which, again, for any practicing lawyer in the room, you'll know is really difficult because as a claimant, you often have nothing. So your client might come to you and say, I walked out of this prison cell the other day and I had 2 black eyes and they've taken my phone and they haven't given it back and whatever. And I also see a doctor and I didn't get to see one. And you'll be like, okay, like I want to believe you, but I have nothing. I have nothing to show this because all of it is going to be contained in the official records and all of it is going to be on the CCTV. The idea that I would have to then go to a judge and persuade them I had a good case before I could even go forward and collect that evidence means obviously many of those cases will never get off the ground. So all of that is awful. It's coming, like we're not in the kind of threat phase anymore, it's real, and there is apparently a draft bill in a drawer in the Ministry of Justice, and we will see it soon. And obviously at Liberty, we will be doing everything that we can to defend the Human Rights Act and working in very broad coalition with a whole range of people across the political spectrum, across civil society, faith groups, you name it, to try and defend the Human Rights Act. And I do think, having said all of those things, that there is reason to be a bit hopeful. And these days, hope is quite a lot of work, I would say, if you're in my job. But I think it is work you have to do to keep doing it and to try and help everyone keep doing it. But, you know, Liberty is a membership organisation, and our membership this year is higher than it has ever been in its nearly 100-year history. Promising, you know, like, we cultivate them, we ask people to join, but we are not doing anything differently this year than we did 5 years ago or 20 years ago. There are members of the Tory party who are really concerned about what's going on, who write to us privately about their worry, not just about the Human Rights Act, but about this whole attack on accountability. There are people, of course, in the devolved nations who see this for what it is and who will make very real the threat that many of these proposals could break up the union. Lots of people believe that if you scrap the Human Rights Act and replace it with the proposals that I've just outlined, it will be a breach of the Good Friday Agreement, for example. And the civil society sector, my space where I am, feels more united and resilient than it ever has done before. There was a time when it was quite a fractured place, and these days there is a real sense of kind of intersectional solidarity, that an attack on one is an attack on everyone. And we saw that in the response to the consultation on the Bill of Rights, where you had women's rights organisations stepping forward and saying, these proposals you're making about immigration are heinous. And you had you had journalists saying, I know you're trying to buy us off with your free speech proposals, but we see what you're doing and we don't agree with it. So I think we're in the best possible place we can be to try and resist some of these awful things. And I also wonder whether the assumption made by this government that this is what people want might be wrong. And I don't know whether it will be wrong enough to save the Human Rights Act, but you might have seen that the Constitution Unit, which is based at UCL, recently did a citizens' assembly on democracy, and the results were really hopeful and also common sense, in that they found that 92% of people agreed that, quote, there is an important role for the courts to play in limiting the laws that can be passed by government when they are seen to challenge basic rights and core democratic principles. And Liberty does research every year across all the kind of human rights and accountability issues. And consistently, over 85% of people agree that no one should be above the law, including those in power, that it's vital that you should be able to hold the government to account and bring cases to challenge injustice. And our most recent polling showed that half of people, which was high, half of people were very or extremely concerned about weakening human rights in Britain. So I don't think if you read the rhetoric coming from this government or from certain parts of the press, I don't think you would think that those were the statistics, but they are, and at some point there may well be pushback. Now, I said I was going to talk a little bit about the critiques. As I say, it's a vital piece of legislation. We've got to defend it with everything that we've got. But I think one of the problems is that we have spent a long time in this defensive pose. The threat to the Human Rights Act, like I say, started before the ink was dry on the piece of legislation 20 years ago. And when you're defending something, it's very hard to hear the critiques, and it's even harder to articulate that you might want something better, because that is perceived as admitting that what you've got is flawed. And so we put a lot of work in at Liberty to try to get people in line to be like, don't talk about it. Don't go and say to the Tories, actually, yeah, we'd love a bit more mental health protection, because they're not going to give it to you, but they will exploit it as a reason to scrap the Human Rights Act. But the problem is that for all of that good strategic reason for being in the defensive pose, it does mean that the planning blight has prevailed for a very long time. And I don't think we really know what a utopian vision of human rights looks like in this country. And when we lose what we have, I don't think we're going to be on the front foot asking for something better. And what we do realize, of course, is that if we don't articulate it and demand it, no one else will. No one else is doing this work. And I think it's very easy to sit around and say, well, it should be the Labour Party, or it should be the Greens, or it should be the Lib Dems, or it should be the academics or the think tanks or whoever. They're not doing it. The politicians are never going to do it. They don't have the time, they don't have the resources, and ultimately this is not the big vote winner that we think it should be. And so it's on us to start doing this thinking. So I want to reflect on two critiques briefly, and then it would be really interesting to hear your reflections on those critiques, but also others that you may have. The first is, like, in a way, just Andrew should get up and talk about, because it's kind of his critique, and also those of other academics like Samuel Moyne in the US. And Andrew and I have talked about this. It's a, like, no disrespect, but kind of an old critique now compared to the old one I'm going to talk about. But this is the critique that human rights, so stepping back a minute, go back in history, right, when human rights was sort of invented in their current modern frame. There was the idea of civil and political rights on the one hand, and social, economic and cultural rights on the other. And civil and political rights is some of the things I've been talking about: free expression, protest, private life, right to vote, right to marry. Socioeconomic rights are things like conceptualizing poverty or access to water, education, housing, healthcare, conceptualizing those as justiciable rights. Now, I said at the beginning, human rights are political, because when human rights were kind of invented in this modern form after the Second World War, the people with the most power around that table were people from the global north, from Western governments, who could conceive of the idea of justiciable civil and political rights, because that very much fitted with their political outlook, a kind of liberal, libertarian, democratic one. What they could not stomach was the idea of extending justiciable rights protections to social and economic rights. Partly, I think, because in that context, of course, the fight against communism loomed very large for those people, and the idea of redistributive rights felt dangerous. It felt like letting in the enemy for them. And partly because it doesn't sit at all well with any kind of liberal capitalist ideology, where what you're trying to do is create what Samuel Moyne calls a free market utopia. So in some countries in the global south, you did end up enshrining socioeconomic rights. So in South Africa, for example, there are socioeconomic rights in the constitution. But in the global north, we don't see anything really of that nature. And of course, you can like do a bit of fudging around the edges, and you can say, well, in the UK, we have managed to expand Article 8 to include reproductive rights, and that's kind of a right to healthcare. So there's like a flavour of socioeconomic rights in some of the way that we've done litigation, but it just isn't. It's not part of our legal culture. It certainly wasn't part of my legal training. And the prevailing wisdom is that, like, if you tried meaningfully to advocate for socioeconomic rights in court, for example, you would be laughed out the door. I think that's probably true right now, but like I say, got to think long term. So one of the critique that Samuel Moyne makes, and then I'll come on to Andrew's critique, and then he can tell me that I've got it wrong when we come to talk about it. It changes, sure. So no.
Tuesday, Wednesday.
Yeah. So Moyne looks back at that process of codifying rights that I've just talked about, and he points to the fact that the emergence of a kind of liberal internationalist movement, which had human rights at its core, made sense for a few decades in the kind of mid-20th century. But then a number of things happened, among them the Iraq War, the use of human rights to justify military intervention, the role of some NGOs who became co-opted in that process, the role of supranational bodies who legitimized it, and then the financial crisis. That all of those things and more demonstrated that the human rights movement was easily co-opted by neoliberalism and then didn't have a meaningful answer to inequality, material inequality. And at the heart of his thesis is this idea that the human rights movement made a fundamental strategic error, that in trying to appear non-partisan and apolitical, human rights advocates accepted the neoliberal norm and its erosion of the welfare state, and they therefore colluded in the consequent dramatic rise of inequality. And so he says, on the one hand, you can chart the human rights movement from the 1950s, and you can say on pretty much every measure, it's like been a success. Amnesty International is bigger, Human Rights Watch is bigger, Liberty is bigger, there are more cases. But on the other hand, that you can track against that a rising global inequality. And I don't think Moyne goes so far as to kind of entirely blame the human rights movement for that, but like he says, you've got to accept that you have a part, or you failed, right? You failed to meaningfully change the course of history in that respect. And that matters for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons I think that it matters is that, of course, poverty and inequality are very reliable determinants for human rights protection generally, not just socioeconomic rights. Being poor doesn't mean you just have violated your right not to be poor. It also means you are much more likely to face other human rights violations. It affects everything from, as you know, life expectancy, education outcomes, access to the labour market, you name it. Poverty is a determinant of inequality and human rights violations. So if the human rights movement can't grapple with it, if the human rights movement can't find a way to say that poverty is a human rights issue and let's work on it in a nuanced, politically neutral fashion, then the human rights movement is failing to even acknowledge the existence of one of the greatest and growing human rights violations of today. So, like Andrew's critique is related, right? It's saying, and just interrupt me, but it's saying that's all true, and inequality is a huge human rights violation and poverty is a human rights violation. It's a lens that just hasn't been used. But that also in the practice of the work, what that means is that the human rights movement, and I think from where I'm standing, it's particularly the kind of human rights industrial complex, has become detached from causes of social justice, detached from community movements, grassroots groups, radical people trying to make radical change. And concerned with questions of structure, of institutions, of frameworks, due process, essentially concerned with looking upwards at what we think is meant to be the answer, rather than looking downwards where we might find better, more radical, more long-lasting answers. And that means, of course, that concepts of solidarity have been undermined, and that you end up with bad results for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons is that people most impacted by human rights abuses play not very much of a part in challenging them or in designing the solutions to avoid them in the future. And the other reason is that the human rights advocates, if they don't see themselves as part of the communities, inevitably become co-opted by the human rights establishment. And that, I think, is like one of the links between the Moyne critique and yours, is this idea that like co-option is a real risk and you have to guard against it all the time. And the people you hang out with every day, like the people you're having meetings with, that's where the risk lies. If you're spending all your time with politicians, the danger is slowly but surely they will draw you in. So that means you need to change in practice and you need to change in principle. And that has been I would say, like a kind of the defining thing of what I have been thinking about for the last 6 years while running Liberty. We can again talk more about this later, I'm not going to go into it now, but we have really tried to think very differently about how we do strategy and how we share power and how we uplift other people and look for solutions around us rather than only looking upwards. And we are working hard, and it's slow, it is a bit of a kind of turning the tanker around because, you know, we have a board and whatever, but we are now, we regularly frame poverty as a human rights issue. We are in our next strategy actively going to be looking at socioeconomic rights. I have no doubt we will talk about the cost of living crisis as a human rights issue in the same way that we talked about the pandemic as a human rights issue. The time when this became most acute, and I mention it just because of the anniversary today, was with the Grenfell tragedy, when Andrew observed, as did others, and I observed it on the day it was happening, that the big human rights institutions, Liberty among them, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, didn't say anything about the root causes of that tragedy. We didn't talk about racism, we didn't talk about immigration control, we didn't talk about poverty, we didn't talk about safe housing. We talked about access to legal aid and proper representation. We talked about there needing to be a full and fearless inquiry. And like, no disrespect to those things, there needed to be them. But you know, 5 years on, I'm not sure anyone in this room would say that an inquiry is the answer. I'm not sure anyone would have said it then either. I don't think we were saying it really in our heart of hearts, but 5 years on, you certainly couldn't say that the answer to the tragedy of Grenfell and stopping that from ever happening again was to have a lawyer-led, judge-led public inquiry. So that was a wake-up call, I think, for me and for others at Liberty. It felt very troubling, to say the least, that these big institutions weren't able to respond in the moment in a way that felt authentic and compassionate to what was very obviously the causes of a terrible human rights violation. So, like I say, slowly but surely, we're starting to think a little bit more about inequality and poverty and what the human rights movement can try and do meaningfully to address those things. And also that how we work is as important as the work that we do, and who we work with is as important as the work that we do. And I think a natural extension of that critique, which again, we're at the foothills of, is saying that climate, of course, also must be framed as a human rights issue, and that the mainstream human rights organisations must now centre that in their work. We've just this year done our first kind of significant bit of policy work around climate. And again, you can see that iteratively, like migration as a result of the climate crisis will be bigger than we've ever anticipated. And so that is a natural home for Liberty's work. But I think, again, it joins up with socioeconomic rights, it joins up with the idea of community interests and social movements when you start to think about how meaningfully to resist failures of governments in their 5-year democratic cycles to deal with a long-term existential threat to humanity, which again will give rise to some of the greatest human rights violations that we've ever seen. So then the second critique, and then I'll stop talking, is this kind of slightly newer one, I would say, which is a kind of abolitionist critique of human rights, a critique of what's described as the carceral or criminal turn in human rights, so carceral as in incarceration. And there are lots of people working on this. The kind of two of the most like interesting but also accessible, I think, people are Karen Engel in the US and Natasha Mavronicolo in the UK. And their critique is that in the same way that the human rights movement was co-opted by the neoliberal agenda, relatedly, the human rights movement has become over-reliant on state power, and particularly coercive and punitive state power, as a response to human rights violations. So that it is now commonplace for human rights advocates to respond to a human rights violation by calling for more surveillance, more criminalization, more imprisonment, more policing, which is kind of wild when you think about it. I mean, it's true, it's a trap that like we really have all fallen into. We go back to my days as a lawyer, and very often, if I was particularly bringing cases on behalf of survivors of domestic violence or families of people who had lost women to domestic homicide, very often the focus of our case would be on the failures of the police to investigate, bring the person to justice, imprison the person, arrest the person, very criminal, very carceral lens on the remedies that we were calling for. And you can see it, so Karen Engel's lens is on the international sphere. So she writes about sexual violence in conflict. And she talks a lot about how, firstly, that the prevalence of sexual violence in conflict as a locus of feminist campaigning has led to a very narrow lens through which feminists can talk about international issues. So obviously, with all of this, no one is saying sexual violence in conflict is not an important thing to be thinking about as a human rights issue, but her point is that it's become part of the canon that we all talk about and the mainstream talks about, to the exclusion of other things like economic maldistribution, like imperialism, like racism, like patriarchy, that perhaps have as much, if not more, of an impact on women and their communities around the world. And what has happened is that as sexual violence in conflict has become mainstreamed as an issue, it's become intertwined with the international law mechanisms that enforce other kinds of international law issues. And that means, and of course, you can see the irony, right? Because a lot of those institutions are male-dominated, patriarchal, imperial institutions. So what happens is that they rely increasingly on militarization and criminalization as a response to sexual violence in conflict. Engel does this brilliant analysis. She goes through 2 decades of UN Security Council resolutions on sexual violence in conflict. And you can see the trajectory in those debates, that every single debate moves further into a criminalized and militarized response to sexual violence in conflict. And she observes in her book on this that it has become almost unquestionable common sense that criminal punishment is a legal, political, and pragmatic imperative for addressing human rights violations. And of course, the UK is no different, and that's one of the things that Natasha Mavronicolo talks about. She observes that the criminal law in the UK is absolutely central to the way that human rights advocates think about addressing human rights violations. And you can see it in the War Boys case, for example, where there was a great irony in my little bubble that the prison lawyers who spend their lives trying to get people out of prison, trying to diminish the prison population, trying to demonstrate how injurious prison is to people, those same lawyers, and I don't mean this critically of them personally, but those same lawyers, when John Warboys was meant to be released by the parole board, it was those lawyers that brought the case that put him back in jail. Now, again, I don't want to get into whether John Warboys, obviously a monstrous man who did monstrous things to over 100 women. And we can talk about whether the right thing is to imprison those people or not, but that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that when faced with that terrible crime, a crime of awful misogyny, the only option available was incarceration, more of it, more punishment, more criminalization, more policing, even though the very people making those arguments know in their heart of hearts that those things are not the answer. They do not deter, they do not prevent, and they do not really punish, nor do they inculcate in the survivors of those crimes any feeling that they have actually experienced justice. And it's the same in both contexts, right? Sexual violence in conflict, domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, the criminalization of those things hasn't made a dent in them actually happening. Now, again, I'm not saying that necessarily we do full abolition. That's not what I'm advocating for here. But what I'm saying is that there has to be a moment where we step back as human rights advocates and we look not just at the violation perpetrated on the victims of the crime, but on the fact that prisons, places of police custody, zones of combat are places of extraordinary violence and human rights violation, where some of the worst things that happen in the world happen in those places. Not to mention, of course, that they are places that are often deeply racist and deeply problematic for anyone from any minoritized community, where they will then be trapped in a cycle of criminalization and violence that they may stay in for the rest of their lives. None of that is good for the communities. We at the moment at Liberty work with a huge range of grassroots and community groups, including many survivors of domestic abuse and also serious youth violence. And obviously no community is a monolith, and you will find in any community representations of any different view. But the vast majority of the people that we are working with, when they talk about the creative and imaginative solutions that they want to see, policing, incarceration, criminalization are not at the core, because those communities have seen the damage that abusive state power can do to them, and they see that it's not a human rights-based approach. So, like I say, I'm not necessarily advocating here for taking a particular position. I'm not saying that the only human rights answer is police or prison abolition. But I am saying that this danger of coercive human rights that I think we have fallen into in this country and in the US has again delimited our ability to imagine solutions that might work better and that actually meaningfully do have human rights at their heart. So I come back to where I started, which is being better at listening to the critiques, being bolder at thinking about different solutions, being more honest with ourselves about when we have failed to acknowledge where there is a human rights violation and what must be done about it. And when doing all of this work, I always think about this lovely quote, which I'm sure you've come across from Angela Davis, who talked about the slow work in always urgent times of building flourishing communities for the long haul. And that feels like, you know, whether you want to get into a row about abolition or a row about poverty and inequality or whatever, the thing that should be uniting us is slow work in always urgent times of building flourishing communities for the long haul.
I'm sure everyone would agree it's a wonderful lecture, incredibly thought-provoking. Doing critical work in the human rights field, as many of us know, is not easy. We have, and particularly in times of feeling embattled, there's obviously a very strong human tendency probably to fall back on what we feel to be true. And those truths sometimes are vulnerable, or they're not shared by the kinds of people who we feel frustrated and not shared by, and that's clearly what this government particularly is advocating. Martha, I've often said this, that Einstein was right about so many things, including relativity, obviously, because the perception of time, as we all know who teach, time goes incredibly quickly when you talk, whereas sometimes when you're listening, it tends to drag on. That wasn't the case at all for your lecture.
Give a barrister a platform then.
Thank you for the citation as well. It was very generous. So some of my work more recently is now focused upon class, and class as an entity, as a label, it's incredibly difficult to define, obviously. But class as an entity that continues to be overlooked by the human rights community. Some of those discussions we had at Liberty a couple of years ago. So sort of developing upon that. You, I'm sure, I'm not having 1,000 things I could say, but that would be hogging this particular privilege. I'm sure there are many questions, many areas of critique, maybe, of Martha's critique. So I'm going to open up the floor to questions. Tara.
Thanks, Martha. That was really interesting. I have to say, though, I always struggle with Moyne, and I struggled for the same reasons with the challenges that you gave now, because much of the critique that you're articulating and much of the vision for the future that you're articulating is already what I see when I work with NGO organizations in places like Colombia and Sudan and South Africa, right? So it doesn't actually seem like it's a failure of the human rights community as if that was a singular entity, but rather it's a failure of specific organizations within the UK and the US, and to an extent, but lesser, France and Germany. And isn't the way forward then just for, like, I hate to say this in a room full of white people, but for white people to shut up a little bit, right? For Western Europeans to actually stop holding on to the mantle of human rights as if it's something that we invented and as if it's something that we really understand well, because we have shown ourselves to not be good stewards of the field. And if we started to rather than sort of replicating the arguments that have already been done, rather take a step back and follow those who've already led, and one quite successfully, right? You pointed to South Africa, not the only state to have economic, social, and cultural rights, not the only state to recognize the role of the environment. And maybe if we took a step back instead of trying to fix and started, I mean, in a way, replicating by echoing what's already been done in terms of that work, I think maybe we would get a little bit further. I am going to also just plug the fact that Essex is the two global organizations on economic, social, and cultural rights are run by Essex human rights alumni who graduated 15 to 20 years ago when Kevin Boyle and Nigel Radley ran our human rights center.
Yeah, so. And all praise to them for sure. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Like, I wasn't I hope I wasn't suggesting, but I certainly wasn't intending to suggest that this like is a novel idea. I think it's an idea in the global south that's been around for a long time. And in fairness to Moyne, like he does kind of point to the global north, global south split, but I agree, like probably doesn't give due credit. I guess where I wonder if there's a distinction is between NGOs that work internationally and NGOs that are country focused. So my concern right now, if NGO, so Liberty is a UK focused organization, like again, for another time, perhaps over a drink, but like there's a lot of difficult, valid critiques of human rights work generally and white saviorism. And I think that applies to all human rights organizations. And it applies particularly to those who airlift themselves into states where they're not even from and they're not trained in or whatever. I think the danger though with saying in the UK, we should step back is like this government, the UK culture, the courts as they currently are, if you step back on this, it's not going to progress. And so I completely agree that like it is about uplifting and recognizing the work that's been done. You know, we'd be standing on the shoulders of giants, in other words. But I'm not sure that it would be enough to just say people should look elsewhere because look at this amazing work that's being done, because they don't want to look, they don't want to see it. In Scotland, they want to a bit, but not in England. So I guess that's what I mean is like, I think there's an onus on those of us working in this context to be proactive about pushing this agenda. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Jim?
And also, when you were talking about your career, I was very sure that I did the same.
Huh.
Possibly. That Mark probably just did the courses, including things like the West and the West.
Yeah, I was just looking that up the other day. They finally renamed it. Yeah,
sure. Also, giving exposure to things like science and studies and social movements in parts of the world. And my coming to human rights was through that route, and then also through my mentor at Essex, Kevin Boyle, and his groundbreaking course as it was in those days, relevant to human rights. So I come to it from that perspective, and I just wanted to make a couple of comments. Now, one thing that I observed during the pandemic, and I work in public health, right? So my criticism is partly about the public health community, but I think it also relates to human rights. Is that we became very tied up in this country about the situation in the UK, with very limited focus on the global injustices and the role that the UK plays in that context. So I found that quite troubling, especially working in public health. You normally are people who work at the global level, suddenly they're just focusing. So how can we be more self-reflective, not just about our own human rights shortcomings in this country, and there are plenty of them, not lose sight of that sort of broader global context. I think there are obviously international NGOs that do that work, but I think it's really important that at the domestic level that we do the same thing. And the other thing I wanted to say was that last week I was at a conference in Norway, Norwegian Sustainable Development, dystopian. And one of the interesting, I think, narratives in that context, it was framed in terms of looking at issues like climate change. What can we learn? What can we learn from Indigenous communities? Saying, well, development of all Indigenous communities, development rights, and how can we look to that? Because are we on sort of cusp of a post-capitalist society? How can we draw on the identities and the beliefs and the worldviews of Indigenous communities, social movements, and post-development movements, to try and reimagine our society and human rights as well in a slightly different way, sort of recalibrating it to the realities of planetary boundaries, as well as inequalities, which I don't want to lose sight of. I think inequalities are in that context. Yeah, so it's a bit rambling.
No, it's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't, other than like agreeing, I think those are both very good comments I completely agree with. I think one of the things that Katya and I were talking about before the lecture is like that perhaps there is, I don't know whether it'd be interesting to hear from your perspective, but it does feel as though, no one lives in silos, but everyone is kind of works in them or often works in them. And I definitely feel like the NGO sector is quite divorced from the academic sector, for example, even though it would be natural to pair up to kind of bring these like bigger ideas, more thoughtful narratives to bear. And Katia was kind of hopefully saying that I don't know how to even use the language of this, but the impact in academia being a kind of more measurable requirement may mean that those worlds kind of start to come a bit more closely together. Because I think a lot of what you're saying is like, I think those conversations are going on in the NGO sector, but not, inevitably perhaps, but not with the kind of level of reflectiveness or I'm sure the kind of discipline that happens in the academic world. And so I think it would only be a good thing if there was a closer connection, and that would allow more of that learning and more of that reflection.
We spent 6 hours, 5 hours in a senior away day just on campus, picking up on some of those points. How does the university develop a series of policies and strategies that do actually try and deliver on those aspirations of changing the world in some ways? You'd be cynical about that in one person, but institutionally, there's various ways.
Yeah, I think it's probably a very unpopular comment, but I was just listening
You're not
to
known
you.
for making them.
Best kind. It's the best kind.
It's so nice. I'm glad that we have that on record. But I just wanted to say that, and I just wanted to say it makes me somewhat uncomfortable listening to you and also to Tara talk about the North-South divide, and not that it doesn't exist, but it seemed to me that you have the assumption that there is that there is a global South civil society community. It always sounds like that, and it just makes me feel uncomfortable because it's just not the case. And so I'm just thinking, and also listening to something you said, I know these are very special cases, but all cases are probably special cases in terms of country cases. And so I spent a lot of time in Argentina, and Argentina, for example, as you will know, has a very much a focus, for example, yes, they have economic, social, and cultural rights, it's very important, but at the same time, retributive justice is super important. For Argentinians, for many Argentinians, you don't have justice. And coming to your comment that victims don't think it's justice if someone goes to prison. I don't think in Argentina many victims will actually think, at least victims of the military dictatorship, they will think justice was done if someone doesn't go to prison. I mean, I always joke with my friends basically saying, how can you be a human rights person if your slogan is everybody should be in prison? But it is pretty much the case, and with Chilean colleagues as well, because of probably the particular history they have. So I'm just wondering to what extent we can really say, first of all, we really know what victims as such want, because I think that's very variable, but also global South, there are just so much variation, so just to throw that in.
Yeah, totally agree about I mean, I think it's a shorthand, I'm sure a lazy one. Yeah, I don't know what you want to say.
There was a reason I left Argentina off of my list of countries. Right? I was very selective as to which ones I chose, because you're right, there's not a singular, just like the human rights field is singular. Sorry, Martha. Martha gave me opportunity.
I'm up for it. Yeah. I also agree with you about victims. I mean, like I say, no one is no community is a monolith. But I do think, I think part of the issue, and I can't speak about Argentina, it's not something I know, not a country I know anything about, but I do think part of the issue here, and you see it in the immigration context, is like, if you are told always that justice looks like X or good immigration policy looks like Y, it's quite an ask for people to then be like, actually, I don't think that is my version of justice. I think my version of justice is a different thing. So I think that's part of what it is to try and do the reimagining. And you don't know what people will think after you've done it or after it becomes more normal. And you can't underestimate, like immigration is a very good example right now, where all of the tracking, so Boris Johnson was pretty single-handed in reducing the salience of immigration as an issue when he was doing his leadership campaign, because he didn't really talk about it much. And when he did talk about it, he talked quite randomly about things like amnesties. And you could track like Daily Mail headlines just had been all about immigration and then just weren't about immigration anymore. And it was in a way, it's like a glib example, but I thought it was an interesting one of like, sometimes like political leadership or thought leadership does actually mean something. And so if you start talking about things differently, reframing them, gathering an evidence base, changing the conversation over a generation, who knows what people will think after that, I guess is my point.
Just picking up on your Laura with beauty, just picking up on what you're saying about immigration and the idea of criminal justice. So my spouse spent huge amounts of money and lots of time. Yeah, we've actually given up. And when I tell people about this, they say that's all bad. But that doesn't often change how they think about the immigration system generally. It's the kind of, what gets like the Shirley exception, like surely that doesn't apply to her. And I was wondering how in this kind of justice can you bridge that gap between what people think about what you have my spouse left, like stay here, and the broader connection of immigrants.
Yeah.
I just wonder what you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's like a kind of granular view in that there's been, as I'm sure you know, like a huge amount of work on reframing immigration, like as a kind of comms piece of work. Often a bit of a dirty word in these circles, but I think like not to be ignored, probably. And so I think that's part of it. I think there are kind of tactical things one can do in the kind of short to medium term that change the narrative around immigration, detoxify it, etc. But like the utopian vision, you think about whether you want borders at all, right?
How's the work going of Liberty? So the last time we
Border
spoke
abolition.
in person, we were discussing shifting to a certain extent Liberty's focus away from its conventional standard work that is established representation for and financial support for and what have you. But there are challenges, there were issues. Are you happy to share some of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been interesting because when we had that conversation, it was, when was it?
A month before COVID.
Was it the month before COVID? Yeah.
Well, COVID was out there.
But it was before lockdown. I think what's happening, where our thinking kind of currently is at Liberty is we have to keep doing some of that foundational stuff. 5 years ago, I was like, I can't really imagine Liberty needing to do work on free expression, like, or whatever, or like protest. We're not going to, maybe we'll get the odd bit of public order legislation, but we're not going to, that's not where it is. It's all going to be about inequality, racism. And this government have really gone after civil liberties in a way that I think we just didn't expect. So we are doing more work on some of that like real old school liberty stuff, but we're trying to do it in a way which kind of takes an anti-oppressive approach, basically. So we will do much more on free speech than we're currently doing. Katya and I touched on this, and we're slightly hesitant to start talking about free speech in a university environment, but anyway, but trying to say like Liberty is a big free speech advocate, and in keeping with being critical of state power, recognises that very often the greatest threat to speech comes from the state, but also recognises the real world equality impacts of unfettered free speech, and so will take and can chart, I think, a slightly more principled, or what we would say is a more principled approach that takes account of impact on particular marginalised communities, trans communities being an obvious one right now, Gypsy Roma Traveller also. But then I think also we're kind of cleaving. I feel like we're doing more of the foundational work, but with the anti-oppressive lens, and then we're going to do more of the work on substantive inequality.
Is that a broader trend? Do you see it in the NGO sector in the UK and the US and outside?
Yeah. I mean, like you see Human Rights Watch doing lots of work on the right to food, the ACLU in the US trying to sort of navigate that same split. I think the funders aren't quite there yet, but I think that's more because the sector, and again, it kind of ties in with this idea of like pairing up a bit more with academic thinking, because I think one of the reasons why NGOs don't aren't very good at that maybe is because we don't think very long term. It really can be like, shit, this government has just announced this policy, like we've got to respond to it today because there's going to be a bill next Wednesday, and like there isn't a lot of like, oh, but in 5 years what we're hoping. So I think part of the thing with funders is not so much that they're like against funding work on poverty or whatever, but more that they're a bit like, sure, but right now, where does that take you? Like, isn't that you just kind of going into an ivory tower? And that's the challenge, is to demonstrate the connection between the like practical impact of the work and the long term thinking.
John and then Jude next.
Thank you very much, Martha. Two things I took from what you said was your optimism, and thank you very much for that. The other thing that I took from it was the, I may say so, the cleverness of those in government and those behind government putting forward a form. And I do see that very strikingly. As one that's been ahead for my career in both the trade unions and academic life, I do feel that a sea change has taken place in quite a narrow time now. Where both have not shouldering the responsibility that they should have for going forward. And I see university leadership really caving in to governments at many levels and not protecting the staff who really want to have freedom of expression in terms of academic freedom. I do see universities as a really important component in this, and I see a lot of optimism coming back to the optimism where university staff are really getting stuck into it. So the question I ask is, if you're talking about vehicles for imagination, could liberty reawaken some of the old values that existed in the past, which I think would act as a blueprint to some of the basic issues and other components go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons, as well as the kind of acute threat on those issues. But I think going back to the point about co-option, I think free expression is a really good example of an issue that's been very adeptly co-opted by the right. And political space, reclaiming stuff is part of what the work that has to be done, and forming the coalitions around that. And that does involve, and I think trade union rights and the role of trade unions is another part of that, where we even see it at Liberty, a generation of people who are not schooled in like the importance of trade unions doesn't feature as heavily in their kind of human rights worldview as it would have done probably 50 years ago. But I think it will come back round. So yeah, I really agree. The foundational stuff, reviving it, but with a sort of modern lens, feels really critical.
Thank you so much for your video testing. I'm not a human rights lawyer. My academic work is not I love your idea of the kind of dystopian versus looking forward. This was my version of dystopia. Most versions of dystopia of silence and othering people, and being from a working class background myself, quite an atypical academic, having been analyst in child comes, I feel like that othering and that passage silence is so many. We're very privileged and not where I am, but when you're talking about the voices of the people that you're around and those other people that are silenced by this, how do we get to that utopia where these people not only have a voice but have a voice that's enlightened enough that they're aware? Because I feel like people aren't, so much othering going on, so silenced and distracted by the shiny of problems, whatever it is that keeps them qualified.
detail of what utopia is going to look like. But I mean, this isn't really like a liberty thing, but I do think it's not surprising. So one of the pieces of research we did recently showed that people don't want to hear the news. They just, you know, like quite understandably, it's my job to read the news, and I really don't like that aspect of my job a lot of the time. So if it's not your job, you're not paid to do it, why would you? But I was like, that's quite an interesting, whether conscious or unconscious tool of powerful people to make it like so unpleasant to even engage that you're like, do you know what, I'm out of this. And so I do it where my brain kind of goes, and partly informed by some of this work that we've been doing at Liberty, which is very community level, kind of, you know, like working in Hackney on what Hackney grassroots groups would want to see from Hackney police in Hackney schools, and then thinking about whether you could scale it, you know, is like the more that people feel like they are empowered, the more that that's a really nice feeling. And, you know, power is a very nice thing to have, and that's why people protect it. So I sort of feel like devolving it more and more and dispersing it more and more is part of the answer. I'm not sure whether you get to a place where everyone is kind of enlightened and fully informed on everything, but I think you maybe get to a place where there's participation at a different level, and yeah, willingness to kind of see outside of one's narrow sphere.
Time has come to a close. Martha, thank you so much. Superb lecture. Thank you. Incredibly thought-provoking. There are real opportunities here for all of us. Clearly, these moments of crisis are also real opportunities. Part, I think, of what we need to do is to stop assuming that we know what people think. If Westerners, Northern Hemisphere people need to get out of the way, then sometimes perhaps middle-class professionals also, when they're engaging with poverty and inequality, also need to take a slightly different and more understanding approach towards what it means to be poor and living under those sorts of circumstances, to stop characterizing poor people as likely to vote for Boris Johnson, more likely to vote for Boris Johnson than their well-educated middle-class counterparts. Not necessarily true. So all of those challenges, I think, are there for all of us to be engaging with. This is a wonderful forum and an opportunity to encourage people to be thinking about this in terms of your own writing, your own research, and your subsequent careers. Martha, thank you. Let's be formal and show our appreciation. We've been on our feet for some considerable time. You've been on your feet for some considerable time. Everyone, please come and join us for your complimentary drink and your barbecue up at Wivenhoe House. And hope to see all of you there. We can relax and talk about human rights or not.